right, welcome to Picture Me Coding, a music podcast about software. My name's Erik Aker. I'm a software engineer in San Diego. This is my co-host, Mike Mull. Want to introduce yourself, Mike?
I am also a software engineer in San Diego. I've been computering for 45 years or so, which I guess makes me both a literal and figurative graybeard.
I don't have a beard. I just started, a dozen years ago, so still green. Mike and I started this podcast to talk about the music we were listening to and writing code, but we don't have money to pay licensing costs for music, so we'll just talk about software, I guess. So, Mike, what have you been listening to lately while working or otherwise?
A few things. I think the one that's been getting the most rotation is the latest album from Godflesh. It's called Purge. I think it kind of has the same quality that we get from the stoner doom that we tend to listen to, bands like Sleep and The Sword and things like that. It's got sort of a hypnotic trance-like quality to it, but it's also pretty aggressive. They're usually classified as industrial metal.
I've never listened to them. Does it hit you in the gut? That's the line I loved from Such Hawks, Such Hounds, a documentary about Stoner Doom on YouTube. It's like riffs that hit you in the gut.
Yeah, it definitely does. And it's, it varies a bit, but it is quite heavy, sometimes face melting heavy, sometimes brain flattening heavy, but it's a little bit more up tempo than what you would probably get in the doom metal, but it's also but it still has that quality where you can sort of zone out a little bit.
So brain flattening, do you find that is that conducive to working, or is it too brain flattening where it feels like you're just zoning out completely, drooling?
Not quite that far, no. Usually, anyway. The just the bass lines tend to be very I don't know what's the word I want. Brain flattening, I guess.
Never listened to Godflesh. As you know, I'm a huge sleep fan, though. I do a lot of work to sleep. I've been listening to Killer Mike's new album, Michael. Have you listened to that one?
I've listened to it a couple of times. Yeah, I think I'm probably less enthusiastic about it than you are, but
I can't stop playing it. I'd be curious about why less enthusiastic, but I love the first song on there. Starts with this like pretty soulful Curtis Mayfield sample. I used to really like Curtis Mayfield. But then, if you were going to predict how he was going to sound when he comes on, you would almost predict something like slower, a little more thoughtful, a little more soulful, and he just comes out swinging, just like with rap music. It's like you ever find yourself on the street and people are fighting suddenly, like fist fighting. And you kind of have this feeling in the back of your brain, like these antennas stand up, like, whoa, what the fuck is happening? I gotta wake up.
yeah, that's happened a couple of times. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I feel every time a Killer Mike album starts. It's like he's just swinging, and I'm like, what is happening? I gotta wake up and see what's going on here. I feel like I have to be awake to listen to what he's saying.
Yeah, I liked it. I think that we touched on this offline a while ago that on the initial listen, my favorite track is the one with LP, which makes me want to go listen to Run the Jewels. So I think that's my biggest issue with it so far.
I actually like all of the songs on there. There's a lot of gospel, religious stuff on there. The cover of the album has a picture of a church on it. He seems to be referencing this childhood growing up, going to churches. But he's got this kind of cynical contemporary take on religion. And I think the thing that always appealed to me about Run the Jewels and Killer Mike is there's a mode of authenticity that goes beyond the typical posturing and almost fraud that occurs in hip hop. It's like, I'm going to tell you real stories and I'm going to try to present myself raw. And it's really, I find it incredibly compelling, the stories he tells and the way in which he's able to communicate these real feelings, real histories, and authenticity. Like, I mean, when I used to listen to Black Alicious, they would have these songs. I mean, I still like Black Alicious, but Gifted Gab would have these songs where he's tangling with the like the industry's push towards more gangster styles. This is in the '90s, and I remember this one song he sang, "Oh, you sound just bubblegum if you're not doing that." And so sometimes in hip hop you have this like, "Oh, if I'm going to be real raw, it's not hard enough." But Killer Mike's just like a guy on the street throwing punches, and there's something really honest about it, and I really like to see it.
Yeah, I get that.
So Under 3000 on the album says, "I do wish I had scientist or engineer friends." You think we could be friends with Andre 3000? Us being engineers, we could like stand in and try to be friends with him.
That seems completely reasonable to me. Yes.
I don't. What would we do? Where would we take Under 3000 if he wanted to have engineer friends? What would we do with him to give him the experience of having engineer friends? Software engineer friends in this case.
Yeah, software engineer friends. That's a good question. Um, Maybe we could try to fix his printer.
I don't think he would find that really that engaging.
You don't think he has a printer?
He probably does. He probably has like a dozen people who work on his printers already. He's got a whole garage full of fancy printers and people who maintain them for him, I'm sure.
Yeah.
He takes out different printers, based on how he's feeling that day.
Do you think he has any need for a custom Linux kernel?
I bet he does, actually. Yeah, Andre 3000, looking forward to the future, kind of sci-fi, interested in what the future's going to bring. Let's bring some new custom Linux kernels. That sounds weird. Let's do that.
Okay.
Our main topic today, actually, did you want to talk about any other things that came up? Any other news or in the things?
Nothing occurs to me.
Main topic for the day that we had was skeptics, software skeptics. So I am not a software skeptic. I just openly accept everything that pours into my ears from the tech media and social media. Just openly accept it, whatever it is. Mike's a little more of a skeptic. So, Mike, you recently mentioned that you had seen skepticism about ChatGPT. ChatGPT, the OpenAI product where they're generating language, and it's seen this like explosive growth in users and interest since the beginning of this year, 2023. I hear a lot of hype about ChatGPT, and I hear a lot of people who are, non-traditional technical backgrounds very interested in it. People using it to generate emails or text messages, whatever. Um, as technology often goes through these hype cycles where something gets hyped and then it kind of cools a little bit. I was curious about the skepticism you said you had been hearing about ChatGPT.
Yeah, so I think it falls into two categories. Um, there's one class of skepticism, which is the debate about whether or not this technology is going to kill us all or not. Um, there was this famous letter that was signed by several luminaries in the field a couple of months ago, calling for a 6-month pause on the development of these things because they're too sophisticated, and they were concerned about what having an intelligent agent like that could conceivably do. Uh, there's also, there's an interesting split there in that it's not just tech bros who are trying to oversell the product by making it seem better than it is, because there's even a split in the between people like Jan LeCun and Jeffrey Hinton, who are some of the originators of these deep learning methods. Hinton is very much in the camp of this is dangerous. We need to start looking at it and start regulating it. And Jan LeCun is like, that's preposterous. This is silly. I don't want to have this argument.
Mm.
So that cycle's been going on for a couple of months now, and I see still a lot of debate about, are these an existential threat? Are they really something that we need to worry about? And I think the opinion has been coming down more on probably not.
Mm. Is that I have a very naive response when I hear this stuff, which is like, this thing call me when it can make me coffee.
Yeah,
It can generate some text. Yes, that can be potentially used in nefarious ways. But humans can generate text that can also be used in nefarious ways.
yeah, I think that's a reasonable viewpoint to take. I think when you and I started looking at these things, and the community in general, you see what these things can do, and your initial reaction is, "Wow, that's surprising." I would not have expected that something which nominally is just generating the next word of text could produce something that seems almost like reasoning. And so I totally understand the initial reaction, but yeah, you're right. The real applications that we've seen so far have been generating text, summarizing text, um, and you know there hasn't been anything out there that's been life changing or you know very practical to people's day to day lives yet.
What's the second category? First category is what people call as the singularity, which sounds pretty sci-fi to me. I don't want to dismiss it because I'm naive. I want to naively say, "Oh, that sounds unlikely." What's the second category? Skepticism.
So the second category I've been seeing is that there was this initial round of this is an amazing productivity tool for me. I can do this. I'm using Copilot. I personally use Copilot, and I find it to be a definite productivity booster. It's um, it's definitely a surprisingly good tool. But I think the second type of skepticism that I'm seeing more and more of now is, wow, it's really hard to build applications with these things,
Mm,
and potentially very expensive to build applications with these things
mm.
because we're relying on commercial implementations of these LLMs, which require us to pay and require us to use their APIs. Um, you and I have both played with now with these toolkits like LangChain and Microsoft's guidance and things like that, and I think we've both seen now that doing something that is actually an application that actually produces the results that you want is not nearly as trivial as typing stuff into ChatGPT.
I had this funny conversation at work this week where we had this presentation about AI tools with a whole technology org, all the developers. We have about, 20, 30 people working in that engineering org. And there's a lot of skepticism from software developers, and their skepticism tends to come from the perspective of, well, I don't think I could get this to do my job. And people who are not developers are looking at it like, wow, we could get this to do their jobs. And when they say it's not going to do my job, they're just afraid we're going to fire them. It's like very simplistic dichotomy there. Um, but I presented it to somebody, from a more on the like stakeholder side. I said, if you came to me and said, do this, build this software feature, and use ChatGPT start to end to build every piece of it, that would be a pretty difficult engineering problem, like, and what are the pieces of it? Yeah, I got to generate some code, but I need to know how that code fits into an existing code base. Maybe I need to talk to some other resources like databases or third party tools over API. I need to know these things. There's some creativity involved. And then I've got to do my like boring administrative tasks, make my branch, make a pull request, get it reviewed, these types of things.
Yeah, and there's all this trickiness to what they call prompt engineering that I think most initial users of ChatGPT are probably mostly ignoring. Um, yeah, I mean, there is this sense that there is still a gap, as you say, between the people who are doing engineering and want to use these tools and the people and are fearing that they might replace them at some point in time, and the people who are kind of hoping that those tools will replace the
Yeah.
engineers because they're expensive.
Yeah. I mean, but simplistically, there's a spectrum of like, on to what extent do we believe that software engineers are code generators? you know, and how sophisticated will our code generation eventually become to where it can do a decent portion of what they do.
Yeah, I think I'm probably trending toward the non-skeptic side on some of that stuff. Based on what I've heard from other engineers, I think I am probably more strongly in the camp of this is going to replace some engineers. Um, I think there will always be specialized things that are difficult for uh, current AIs to do, and so this is not going to eliminate the software engineering industry.
When you
But
say some, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think there are some sort of tasks where um, these things are going to get good enough to replace some subset of engineers.
I want to
And
zero in on the sum. You can hear me just sort of like trying to hold back. What's the sum? Who's sum? What's that category?
yeah, I'm trying not to be too precise because I don't want to offend anyone.
Oh, okay. All right.
But I think there are things. I was looking at a website earlier today where they were talking about building Streamlit applications using LLMs, and
Mm.
you can build relatively sophisticated front ends to say data science projects with this kind of thing. And so I think there will probably be some, if you're like a programmer inside a corporate entity, uh, as opposed to say somebody working for a software company, and you're producing tools that are not sold to the outside market, I think some of that work is probably going to either go away entirely or be moved to people who are more domain specialists rather
Mm.
than programming specialists.
Okay, I could kind of see that. I think you're definitely right about that prompt engineering. It's surprisingly more difficult than it looks on the surface, where a library like Microsoft Guidance makes it programmatically a lot easier, but it's doing stuff below the surface where it's priming the agent, and formatting the stop sequences, for example, and then you don't have to deal with those kind of naughty details. But your last comment you made brings me to this thought experiment that I had this week, and then I realized I stole this from somewhere, and I'll tell you where I stole it from. It was an accident. Um, so the thing that I often struggle with is how do I validate the output of an LLM? How do I know that it's correct? And let's say, for example, I have a software engineering task. I want to generate some code. I want it to do a particular job. And let's say I don't have a background writing software. How do I know that what it generates is correct? I can look at its behavior. And so here's my thought experiment. Maybe you might say that's not a good relevant analogy. I imagine it's like if I had a universal language translator, say, and I can send messages out in another language, right? And then the question it becomes, how do I know? But it doesn't go backwards. So like I can go to Japan if I'm around people who do not speak English. I can feed my statements into this translator. It'll spit out Japanese. It won't listen to the Japanese and translate it back. Just in my, like my hobbled thought experiment here. I can only look at the behavior of the people who are receiving my Japanese from my machine to determine if it's correct. Um, how do I know if it's correct? How do I know that I'm actually communicating with them?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it.
Is it an okay analogy, or is it too artificial of a thought experiment?
Well, I think an analogous thing is I've seen people apply these tools to things that they know about. So they want to see how accurate it is, so they ask it questions about, say, the company that they work for, or they ask it questions uh, about classifying something where they know what the outcome should be. And so the parallel there is that is like, translating language and getting a response on the face of the receiving individual that doesn't look puzzled or offended.
Hmm.
Um, but there's no there's no equivalent of the person hearing the translated language looking puzzled or offended, because quite often the if you don't know what the answer should be, the answer still seems perfectly reasonable, even if it's wrong.
Yeah, it's like you got to look at the behavior. Like if you unleashed an LLM based application on the world, you put it on a website, you have people arbitrarily submitting things, and I know there are some dangers there, which we're going to just ignore for now. But you just sort of trust that it's passively working, right? Like you're thinking, what's the behavior of my application that I can use to validate that it's operating within my bounds and I'm hoping for. It's like it's a little too shaky for me.
Yeah, I guess in some applications it'll be clear because if it won't make the paperclip properly or whatever. But um, if it's I've seen sites where you can drop in a PDF and it will summarize the content for you. Seems like a very useful thing. But if you're asking for a summary of the content, there's a good possibility that you are not an expert in that topic. And so what it summarizes for you may be difficult for you to evaluate. Um, so my understanding is that people are working on these hallucination problems so that the LLMs will stop making stuff up. But I think it's I guess it's the same thing with human beings. If you don't know something in detail and somebody tells you a fact, you have to fact check it elsewhere. Um,
Hmm. Sounds, there's a Wittgenstein philosophical investigations reference here about, knowing the meaning of a word is equivalent to using it correctly. Using it correctly is maybe following some sort of implicit rule about how that word gets used. But actually, that's a distraction. I was happy with my thought experiment, and then I realized, oh, wait a minute, I think I stole Searle's Chinese room from the 80s. Whoops. Searle was a professor of philosophy when I went to Cal, so I didn't take any of his classes. There was a lot of commentary about Searle and his classes on campus. But the Chinese room thought experiment was really a rejection of earlier versions of AI, where it was if I'm sitting in a room and someone feeds, like I get papers with Chinese characters printed on them through a slot in the wall, and I feed them into a computer and it spits out more Chinese, and then I feed that back out. The argument is I don't actually know Chinese. I'm just, spitting out what the computer spit out. And people have argued about this, that maybe there's a systemic understanding of Chinese. Maybe the person who's feeding the papers back and forth is equivalent to a CPU, but there's some sort of, you know, broader thing that has a synergy that altogether understands. And I don't know about that. Um, but the Searle's Chinese rooms feels ultra relevant to the LLM because it's similar, right? It's an LLM is just generating text. It doesn't. There's a way in which we could try to argue about whether or not the LLM understands text, and then we get into this weird discussion of, do I understand text?
yeah, I think it is a good analogy in the sense that it's not clear to me that any of these models have any sense of what they're actually doing. I don't even know how you would investigate that.
I saw this funny example where we're talking about tokenization, right? So the models will break words up into tokens, and then they're looking for similar tokens, and then they're predicting tokens. And so that a token is a portion of a word that tends to show up uh, frequently, or maybe not frequently, but they can use it as a kind of numerical prediction inside the neural network. And a common token is the three letters in English ing, so that submitting a prompt with the word read is usually better than submitting a prompt with the word reading, because the ing as a token will permute the output, right? It's more likely to predict tokens that have ings in them. That seems to me like a pretty good example that it doesn't really know the meaning of the word.
I agree, but I also wonder how do you know that it doesn't know?
Hmm.
I I'm curious now. I have to look this up later. What is the basis for trying to determine if something else has consciousness? I mean, there's obviously the famous Turing test, but my suspicion is that a lot of these LLM tools could probably pass the Turing test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're asking theory of mind questions, and I did very poorly in those classes. So I'm just going to sort of
I didn't
pass
take
over
them at
that in
all. So
silence. I did see an interesting article this morning. Um, was about it was called Poison GPT: How We Hid a Lobotomized LLM on Hugging Face to Spread Fake News. This is from Mithril, the security company. They made a poisoned LLM. They put it up in an open source collection of LLMs, and then they had it just sort of return fake news. And their argument was, there's a supply chain attack in here, and my immediate kind of cynical response was, is it any worse than any open source distribution? Like any open source library distribution, any package manager? Um, but I think the reason why it sounds a little scary potentially is, again, it's hard to validate. Why did it produce the result that it did? I have absolutely no clue in the case of an LLM.
yeah, it's interesting that we saw that OWASP list earlier this week as well. That people are starting to already develop guidelines about the nefarious things you could potentially do with these LLMs.
Okay, so here's my last set of questions for you. I like to stay maybe objective about hype in software. We are subject to hype. Sometimes we get caught up in it. Um, and me being green, you know, just a beginner, I'm pretty susceptible to hype. I want to know what feels different to you. Well, let's go with similar. Is there anything about the ChatGPT hype that feels like, oh, this reminds me of something 10 or 20 years ago? Is there anything that feels pretty different now? I want to go with same first. Does it remind you of hype around some other technology?
I think there are certain parallels to the early days of the internet. Um, I think when most of us saw the original web browsers coming out of NCSA, the first time a lot of us saw Mosaic, we realized, this is going to be interesting. This is going to be potentially transformative. Um, it was the first time where the internet, you could get to content on the internet that was not behind a password. Up to that point in time, we'd been using things like Anonymous, FTP, and Gopher. And now we have this tool where you can go to a page and it gives you the content, and there may be graphics and formatting in that context and hypertext links in that content. And so there was understandably a huge amount of enthusiasm for that. But it went way past the reality really quickly. So, I remember articles from the 90s about how we were all going to be having telesex, and, the everybody had these visions of neuromancer being our near future reality.
That's what I was going to ask. Did you think of William Gibson?
Yeah, William Gibson. Not his fault, obviously, but the extrapolation from here's a web browser to we're all going to be living in the metaverse is pretty radical. But it seemed plausible in the 90s. We had these networking tools coming online, and it was the early days of virtual reality and all of that. It was fairly easy to extend those things into some future where they could all be combined. And so I don't think those things were outlandish, but clearly in retrospect they were way too premature and were often promulgated by people who didn't really understand the limitations of the technology.
Classic. Yeah. Just like me. Yeah. This is great. This is going to be great. It's going to change the world. I don't really get it.
Yeah, I think we're saying that now, which is why you have this dichotomy of where are the applications. There's one camp of people saying, where are the applications? This isn't doing anything useful for me yet.
For LLMs.
For LLMs. And you have another camp of people saying, this is sentient. It's probably going to kill us when it realizes that we are not useful to it.
And so what you're
So,
saying is both of those poles on a spectrum they're kind of a little bit off. Maybe one is more off than the other.
yeah, I tend to think they're probably both wrong, but the positioning reality in the spectrum between one pole and the other is, I think, still not something that I could do. I'm not sure that anybody is, has a good enough glimpse of the future to know where that's going to land.
I really like your example of early days of internet, early days of web browser. Using a web browser feels so prosaic to me now. So just, it's a tool that I don't think about at all. I think through it, which is the function of a tool. If it works well. You forget it exists.
Yeah.
But I'm also talking to you through a web browser. I have a video, I can see you, I'm talking to you. And there was some prediction of that. If you showed me this interaction in the early 90s, I think I would have been pretty astounded that that was going to become commonplace, prosaic.
Yeah. I remember in the early 90s somebody making a telephone call over the internet. Um, the what we is now very run of the mill voice over IP,
Mm.
and just being blown away that that was a thing. I was like, wait, aren't the phone companies going to stop this?
We're going to kill their business model. We're going to talk through the browser.
Right.
I'm going to phone people up through my browser. So, is there anything that feels really, really different about the LLM revolution, LLM hype?
Well, I personally, I think the different thing is there. This is kind of an inflection point. Other people have said this, but it does feel like an inflection point in the AI history. Um, Obviously, there was kind of a big uh, surge in interest with the work in deep learning that started to become visible to the public 10 or 15 years ago. But um, this feels different somehow. It does feel like it feels to me like a situation where the results of these artificial intelligence are surprising to me. Nothing about the deep learning models are very sophisticated, but there was nothing really surprising to me about the fact that they were good at image recognition or the
Mm.
fact that they were good at voice recognition or whatever.
These are classification problems, you mean? Like classification problems are less surprising?
Well, I mean, they were problems that people were already trying to solve,
Oh,
and so that in some cases, the deep learning approaches did a better job. So it was surprising that neural networks had made this resurgence because there was kind of this surge of interest in them in the 90s, and then they kind of went away, and then they came back, and so that was an interesting technological development. And some of the results that came out of that, and the reinforcement learning stuff like AlphaGo and
mm,
the protein folding stuff is just amazing.
yeah.
It's really amazing technology that's doing interesting things. But there's stuff now that um, it's not only doing stuff that is sophisticated, it's doing stuff that I just didn't really envision before.
New applications. Like, wow, this is a surprising application of this technology. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, like the fact that you can make videos where you just sort
Mm.
of describe the style and the content that you want, and there's legitimate concerns that people are just ripping off existing content on the internet and
Mm.
sort of just mixing it together.
So,
But the
with enough
fact,
training data, we could generate our own podcast or generate our
yeah,
own Killer Mike album.
yeah, probably,
I think one other example that comes to me, and this is probably the last one I'll have, is I often find when I'm thinking about these tools, I wish I could sit down with one of the professors I had in college. His name was Hubert Dreyfus, and he was a Heidegger scholar. And in the 60s, he famously wrote these like deeply critical papers about AI research at MIT, where he was a professor. And he became such a thorn in the side of AI researchers that they kind of cultivated this whole branch of AI research called Heideggerian AI. And he had this example, and I'm pretty sure I've told you this example. And this, I think it's still relevant to what the LLMs are doing, but he had this critique, and again, he's a Heidegger scholar, so Heidegger's interested in meaning. Um, he had this critique about what they were doing in AI research at MIT in the 60s, which was generating these and 70s, generating these sort of rule-based fact machines. And so they had and I'm not going to do a great job describing it because this is all just secondhand from him. He said they would feed a lot of rules and facts into their machines, into their programs, and then they would put in a plain text sentence and they would try to get back some sort of reasoning back out of it to sort of figure out how to programmatically create an AI that can reason about things in a human sense. And obviously, a human understanding of the world has this huge amount of context. And so that's where his Heideggerian thing comes in. Because Heidegger is all about I exist in relation to this hammer that I'm hammering with. There's a context which allows meaning to exist. It's this constellation of relationships between me and things in my environment. Anyway, the example that he gave was they fed this sentence into their AI and they waited for its answer. And the sentence was, Carl fell into the river. He was pulled down by gravity and he drowned. And the AI responded, and gravity drowned too. And so driving stylists love this example because it's so nonsensical, and it was such a great example of using words without understanding what they mean. I feel like the LLMs would commit the same mistake. They would, depending on their training set, they might say gravity drowned too. But maybe the question is, would a human too? Like if we talked about gravity as an anthropomorphized thing.
Yeah, I'm unsure. I mean, the LLMs don't have any context in that sense. I mean, my take is that they don't have logic, so to speak. So they don't know that gravity is not an individual that's not subject to the same rules that the person drowning is subject to. But it's not clear to me that they would make that particular mistake. I mean, they do make some very interesting mistakes, as both of us have seen. Surprising mistakes, but
is that in the category of hallucinations? Surprising hallucinations?
Well, hallucinations, and also I've seen, we've both messed around with the fine tuning stuff where you provide it with prompts and completions, and I've seen cases where the completions were ridiculous or outlandish or comical.
Do you have any that come to mind?
Well, there was the one that I showed you before, where I was trying to do some fine tuning on transaction descriptions from a bank account, and so I provided it some fine tuning data, and one of the results that it returned was something along the lines of transgender, which.
So wait, the bank account transaction, the transaction was a transgender transaction, is what the LLM told you.
Yeah, which I thought was interesting because it wasn't in the training data.
That's not in your training set. There's no bank transactions with that in there.
Nothing in the fine tuning set, and I have no idea where that.
It just hallucinated that was relevant to you. So here's a guy with no hair. He's been around a while. He's going to be really interested in this word, transgender. Let's make sure it's in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think somehow to the model that made sense. When it looked at the data set and figured that was a plausible completion for some of these things, but how I have no basis to understand where that came from.
Well, that's probably good for our conversation here. Obviously, we can't really resolve this stuff, and we don't know where it's going to go, but we could still be skeptical about it. I think I want to. What should we call this episode? I think we should call it "And Gravity Drowned Too," a reference to the great Hubert Dreyfus, the Heidegger scholar.
That's a good title.
All right, thanks so much, Mike. It's great talking to you. My name is Erik Aker here in San Diego, and my co-host Mike Mull. This has been Picture Me Coding, a music podcast about software.